Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm here with my good friend, Dr. Angela Birts. We met through government contracting and been able to help her with some of that as she gets started in her business. But she's got an incredible resume, and I can't wait to hear more about it, kind of how you get started, your backstory, where you grew up, and some of your thoughts on everything that's happening now with everything happening in Washington, D.C., and some of the changes in business and the spaces that you operate. Professor at UC Santa Cruz, business owner. I would love to know more about your story. So, Angela, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jordan, for having me.
Yeah, so where did you grow up originally?
So I grew up in East Palo Alto in the Bay Area from birth until age 18 when I went away for college. And Bay Area is situated in smaller, I mean, it's a city, but it's still smaller neighborhoods. So I grew up in the neighborhood, the Gardens, in a apartment complex.
Okay. Okay. Now, if people don't really know East Palo Alto, now that you just say like by IKEA, right?
Yeah, by IKEA, the other side of Palo
The
Alto.
other side of Palo Alto, yeah.
Yeah.
Where did you go to college?
I went to Lake Forest College in Illinois, which is around 30 miles north of Chicago, a small liberal arts college. What I loved about the college is that it's incredibly diverse because around 30% of the student body population are international students. So it
Oh,
was a
wow.
great mixture of domestic diversity, but the international diversity that made my learning experience, classroom, extracurriculars, amazing to be surrounded by people with different worldviews and upbringings.
Very cool. Yeah, I had somewhat of that experience when I moved to British Columbia after high school,
Mhm.
and some of my classmates were from other countries, and just seeing the difference. Even just Canada itself kind of has a different mentality and attitude towards different cultures and immigration and stuff. And so it was refreshing to just meet people from different parts of the world and be in Canada instead of the US, right? Because it's
Right, I
just a
could
different,
only
it's a
imagine.
totally different dynamic, right? So oh, great. So you got your bachelor's there, and
Yes.
then you obviously you have your PhD. So tell us about that journey. When did you decide like I'm going to continue on even further with your education?
That is such a good question because I remember it distinctively. So I graduated from undergrad in 2008. That was during the recession. And so I struggled finding a job. My goal was to live in Chicago because I loved it, to stay in that area, but realistically, I couldn't find a job. So I moved back home and my job was at the College Track Program. It's a nonprofit organization that specializes in college access and helping low-income students of color get into college. And I'm an alumna of that program. So my job was an academic tutor program coordinator. So I was responsible for recruiting and hiring graduate level and PhD students at Stanford, Santa Clara University, pretty much all the local colleges to come on site and tutor high school students in math, English, and so forth.
Oh, wow.
So as a young person, I'm connecting with students in high school and their families, but also my peers, people within my age group. And so I ran that center of the room from like processing and hiring all of that and then supporting the students. But there was a coach that worked with students too that was there. And he would always drop by my office and he would just like say, "What's next for you? Like you're doing so well in this room, Angela, but I see so much more in you. Are you going to go to
Hmm.
graduate school? What are your next steps?" He just kept belaboring that topic over and over again. But it started to resonate with me. And it's so interesting because it came up that I needed to further my education when I pretty much saw like the discrepancies in learning for students, which was similar to my upbringing. And what I mean by that is there were very high achieving students who still were not gaining the skills that they need to be necessarily college ready. And though they
Mhm.
were in that college access program, I still knew a little bit about the historical factors in the high schools that they attended, with them being tracked and placed in like remedial classes instead of AP classes. And I remember that from being young. So something shifted in me to think about this is something I want to study. I want to study education, education policy. Why are the students still experiencing this 20 years later? Why did I experience that being a quote unquote gifted scholar in my district and then showing up to private school for high school and not knowing what a thesis statement was? So I wrote
Right.
my graduate school essay on that, my upbringing and my story around educational inequities and how I wanted to work on policy. So that is when I got accepted into Stanford University, and that program was called POSE. It's still around, Policy, Organization, and Leadership Studies. And then from
Hmm.
there, I did some other work in other nonprofits, and then I eventually applied to San Jose State University for my doctorate.
That's amazing. What an amazing story. And for me, I've had a lot of different types of folks
Mhm.
on this podcast, and from music to education to business. And
Mm.
one of the things for me, I'm open to different points of view and to diverse schools of thought. But for
Mhm.
me, what's kind of a non-starter or kind of a deal breaker is if you believe that if you don't believe that if circumstances were different, that the results might be the same, meaning that there's nothing inherently good or bad about any race or gender, only the circumstances. Ultimately, people make their own choices, right? But
Right.
a lot of that, what you mentioned, can be tracked down to circumstances because we
Absolutely.
struggle with that here in Monterey County. No matter how bright and talented a student might be, they're only at school a certain amount of time. And if
Hmm.
they're going home to a different environment or a lack of support, and a lack of opportunities, then their growth is stunted, so to speak. And so you have some students in private environments who have the resources and maybe they don't have the talent. And then you have some
Right.
students that have the talent but no resources. And you kind of see that play out because the statistics show test scores and entrances to certain institutions that lead to roles in corporate America or in government. I mean,
Yeah.
it's one thing to say there's a bias. It's another thing to be able to prove it with statistics and facts.
Right.
And I know that's part of the work that you do.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And I'm glad that we're on the same page because everyone's not on the same page as that.
Right.
Right? It's the approach that, like, if
As
you're
we can
set
see
by the
currently.
bootstraps, those are, other people's children. It's not my responsibility. That is a mentality that some folks have when they hear these stories about children who need access or just individuals who were born in circumstances that were beyond their control, but they genuinely do want to thrive and want more for themselves. So I'm very much a person who's like more interested in humanity and
One of my favorite
in
quotes from
others.
Dr. King is
Hmm.
regarding that, you know, and he talks about how America tells us to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, but what about those who have no boots?
Mm.
And that's not the exact quote, but in that range. And it's true, right? To have folks that have historically been underserved or unrepresented or have a different set of resources and circumstances, it's just, starting from behind. But the positive side of that is there have been folks like yourself who have made
Mm.
such amazing, amazing steps forward and are continuing to pay it forward by reaching back and helping those that were in maybe the same circumstance that you were, just needed an opportunity.
Hmm.
So once you decided to get your PhD, I mean, that's uh, the average person could not handle that kind of a workload. I'm right now getting my associates while working full time and also
Hmm.
continuing to run businesses. And I think the only way that I'm able to do it is that I have an amazing wife who is also a fan of education, and we don't have kids yet. That's the only way that I'm able to juggle all of this. How did you, after getting your bachelor's, your master's, handle getting your PhD? Because I know it's a lot of work. I'm seeing how much work it is to get my associates right now, and I'm like,
Right.
oh man, I can't imagine.
That's a good. So I do want to clarify. I have an education doctorate. So the PhD is around more philosophy and theory, and though the
Right.
education doctorate is too, it's for practitioners. So to
Good.
that point, I was working full time when I earned my doctorate. I was a director of diversity and inclusion at a private independent school
Okay.
in a team of 16 volunteers, like faculty members and parents, a part of a diversity committee, and spearheading a strategic plan for diversity for 5 years, along with family engagement, student engagement, board training, and so forth. And I did it simultaneously. And it was
Okay.
hard. It was hard, but what I appreciated, I was able to be in that program and look at theory and think about application. Because
I love
sometimes
that.
as a student, we could like you learn about these particular topics, but because I was situated in a 6 through 12 school, I had to always confront how does this actually work if I apply it in my environment. So I felt like it made me more critical, but in a good way, and more receptive to being creative to work around some of the challenges that I saw. And the great thing is that in my cohort, I was in there with a principal, a vice principal, special education teacher. One of our classes was taught by a superintendent. Like these were hardcore educators in the field. So I
In the
felt
trenches with
in
you.
the
Yeah.
trenches. So I felt going that route with the EDD was absolutely amazing because we were really boots on the ground doing the work.
I love that. I love that. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
I think a lot of folks, you don't realize, that there's different levels of education, or I think there's a general lack of understanding when it comes towards the educational world. Obviously people think, oh, teachers are important, or teachers
Right.
are underpaid or overpaid, or depends on who you talk to, right? And I mean, with everything happening with like the Department of Education, for instance, what is that, knowing that you've dedicated your life to this world and this field, and what are your thoughts on some of the things that are currently happening in regards to the Department of Education?
I have a lot of empathy because anyone who chooses to go down that trajectory to work for a Department of Education or choose education as a career, my assumption is that their heart was in it or they're in that type of role because they are interested in the betterment of our future, of our children. So to be able to see that threatened or taken from you, that cannot be easy at all. Because with that loss or with the pressure and the dismantling of a lot of those positions, there's also thinking about what will happen with students.
Mm.
What resources are at stake for
Right.
students who are marginalized or already needing interventions and support? Is it going to exacerbate the conditions that they're already experiencing? Will the gap widen? I'd imagine that if I were working at the Department of Education, that would be at the forefront of my mind, especially if
Absolutely.
my years of service or a project or whatever initiative I was working on is, threatened or taken away from me. It would be taken away from the students as well.
The counter argument to that would be that education belongs, um, in the states, right? That the states should be kind of in charge of education, which for the most part they are.
Right,
Most
right.
the Department of Education primarily handles the loan program, which I've heard is switching to the Small Business Administration,
I've heard that
and they
too.
have other, which may be better. They also, a lot of the funding from the federal government, the states end up managing it anyway, right? You work
Mhm.
with the state of California as an educator. Um, as a business owner, not as an educator, as a business
Right.
owner, knowing that systems matter, knowing that efficiency matters, knowing that you have to run your staff and your business on a budget and effectively and efficiently. Um, what are your thoughts on that? Obviously, just getting rid of the Department of Education is a political move. It's throwing fresh meat to a certain base of voters, however you want to phrase it.
Right.
But in your case, putting on your business hat, how do you look at how things can, government can be wasteful and inefficient. You know that firsthand. How
Mhm.
would you approach that? Not so much concerned about education, but concerned as a business, how do we run this better?
Yeah, I still think things could be done. Incremental change could happen, but I know
Incremental.
some business leaders or the way that you could look at it is that you just completely get rid of everything and start completely over. But that's not the only way to impact change. It could be an
Right,
alternative to that, and that's through a series of months, you start to think about, okay, what can we let go of and how can we combine resources? It doesn't
right.
always have to be as drastic. So I would say that is another way to take a look at it. And I think it will be interesting to take a look at the data to see the impact on
Mhm.
cutting back on funding and see how it's better leveraged. I think it's too
Yeah,
soon to say if it's
right.
successful, this approach, but I will be interested in knowing the long-term benefit of this approach. If
But
there
you're
is
saying you would recommend maybe taking a surgical knife as opposed to a sledgehammer, might be more
abs-
effective.
yes, absolutely.
Well, certain politicians are not known for the Midas touch.
Right, right.
And we're seeing firsthand. Um, some people would call it leadership, other people would call it recklessness. The power in this day and age that words do matter. Words can change global economies overnight.
It's
Words
true.
can, uh, change just a lot of things in a short amount of time. And so, as someone who's studied education, who's careful and in what they say and how they present themselves, like how are you seeing the importance as you're making this pivot? and we'll get to the start of your business, but as you're pivoting, how is it important now that more than ever is messaging and really being kind of succinct and really coordinated in how you present yourself and your message?
That's such a good question. Again, I'm about making deliberate decisions and strategic decisions. So I don't make rash decisions based on the climate, whether if it's the country or organization. So even still, there's no consensus on what this new language is going to be. And I think waiting it out and investigating and listening and being attentive to how different places are grappling with what language you can use. But I think that there's something to note that's really important. And this is for anyone who like look at stuff from like an equity mindset or that thinks about outcomes of others. Pushback is inevitable. Not everyone has the belief system in a capitalist society on how things should be done. Some people believe that people are in their place of where they should be. And
Right.
right. So I say that to say it's always a constant negotiation. Right now, it is exacerbated. And unfortunately, because it's really scrutinized, there are consequences for using certain language or continuing in a path that people have been. But it doesn't negate the fact that frameworks are still there and they have been in place for a reason. But you do have to know your audience and be diplomatic. But I would say myself in this industry, that's something that I have to learn earlier on because I worked in environments where it was majority other. So I was the minority.
Right.
Yeah.
I love that you said that about being diplomatic. And I just kind of have always been.
Mhm.
My dad is of Mexican heritage. My mom is of
Mhm.
European heritage, American, and
Mhm.
growing up with different cultures, being a Gemini, I don't know what it is, different generations, kind of the bridge between X and Z. I've just always been able to see both sides.
Mhm.
And obviously, we know there's good people and there's bad people, right? And you can be on a certain set of beliefs and be a good person, but then other people are using it to hurt people and for negative reasons. And it's I try not to get too into the mud on a lot of these arguments because I don't think they're productive.
Okay.
And so you're talking about being diplomatic. To me, diplomacy is not being fake or cowering to anything. Diplomacy is reading the room. Diplomacy is having the emotional intelligence to recognize who is even capable of understanding what you're trying to say anyway, and not
Mhm.
wasting your breath. And so sometimes the diplomatic thing to do is not say anything because you
Mhm.
realize nothing you say is going to change this room. But then you make that mental note of this is either a room that I don't want to be in anymore, or this is a room that needs drastic change, and I'm going to do it from
Right.
the outside in or
Right.
from the inside out.
Mhm.
And so just to me, diplomacy is the emotional intelligence to read the room and act accordingly in a way that's true to your character and your
Absolutely.
goals.
And when I talked about my experience at Lake Forest College, I gained those skills. But if I even go back to my upbringing, growing up in East Palo Alto, and I lived in government housing, but it was culturally diverse. So I grew up with neighbors that were Mexican, Fijian, Samoan, Tongan. We're different racial ethnic backgrounds, but obviously we were coming from a similar social economic background, but there are cultural differences. So even being a child and you're managing relationships with people, you learn those skills like empathy and listening, arguing, making your point. So fast forward to where we are now, right? I would say my entire life has been setting me on a trajectory of being in places cross-culturally connecting and working with people.
I love that.
Yeah.
For those that maybe are unfamiliar with these terms or with this
Right.
work, can you explain, in your opinion, the difference between equity and equality?
Absolutely. So when we use the word equality, it's about sameness, making sure, everyone is treated equally and treated the same. When we use the word equity, the distinction is that you're recognizing that there are economic, political, historical factors that have denied certain groups access to resources and opportunities. So equity says we have to create a pathway to make sure that people have what they need to thrive. That could be in the workplace,
Yeah,
it could be in a school setting, but you can't discount history when you're focused on equity.
I agree. And people have different feelings about or different perspective maybe on how history evolved over time. They have their lens that which they view it from. And there's some truth to that, but there's also some facts that are undeniable, right? And I remember studying for my real estate exam, and a big
Okay.
portion of the real estate exam, believe it or not, has nothing to do with selling houses. It has to do with civil rights, has to do with redlining, has to do with
Mm-hmm.
folks that were denied
Mm-hmm.
lending opportunities and couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. I mean, these were practices that were legal practices at the time until some of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So this is on the real estate exam.
That's right. I didn't
So
know
in order to
that.
get my real estate license,
Okay.
you have to understand and acknowledge that once upon a time, it was in the law that
Mm-hmm.
you certain neighborhoods couldn't be mixed, and certain people under this income threshold or of this ethnic background couldn't live in this neighborhood. I mean, it was literally, there were laws, even in the Bay Area. I mean, that's part of the history of East Palo Alto. If you understand the history of East Palo Alto, it doesn't make sense to the rest of Palo Alto, the way that it's zoned and the way that it's the
Mm-hmm.
economic socioeconomic status of a lot of the folks. It's changed a little bit more recently because of the influx and the growth of Silicon Valley. But
Yeah.
it's, if you understand the difference between Palo Alto and East Palo Alto, that tells you everything you need to know about everything you just said.
Yeah, it's true. And I'm glad you brought that up too. And that is why, are we jumping into the language conversation?
You can, yeah,
Yeah, it's
totally.
important to remember what terminology mean. But I also recognize this is not something that a lot of people study, or it may not be like your average layperson is sitting around talking about equity, equality,
No,
historical, they may not be
yeah,
thinking about that. So I think I see it as an opportunity to educate, because though there is a lot of language right now about this topic, it doesn't necessarily mean people understand what the purpose behind some of these frameworks and terminology, the original meaning behind it. And I think it creates and people could do what they want once they have that information, but I never like to assume that everyone has a baseline understanding of everything that
right.
I know, because I don't have that for everything that another person may know, right?
Exactly. True. Well, I grew up in church, and I think you did as well. And
That's
the church
right.
that I grew up in was very similar to the neighborhood that you described. Very diverse. We had a military base nearby, and
Okay.
it was very diverse. I mean, every Pacific Island,
Mhm.
African Americans, every Latino. Like, it was, the potlucks and the music were incredible. But I remember hearing messages like God speaks how you listen, meaning that God speaks in a way that we understand, right? And so we sometimes try to, and I think you use different examples. Like for me, and not to take it here, but that's just both of our background. There's
Okay.
different types of folks. So, for instance, John the Baptist, right?
Mhm.
He was a wild man in the wilderness, just a
Yeah.
prophet calling it how it was, right? Screaming like
Hmm.
hellfire and brimstone out in the wilderness. That was his calling. And I
That's
believe
right.
that there is a time and a place for prophets like that, maybe like a Malcolm X who just are militant and who call it
Mhm.
how it is and call it out. There is a place for that type of energy. There's
Mhm.
also a place for, in the Bible, a guy named Daniel who was in captivity but rose to prominence because he understood all the languages and all the cultures, and God was able to use him to lead, protect his people, and then also be a prominent leader within a foreign land because he was able to, be in different rooms and understand different cultures and understand different things. And so you have to ask yourself, when it comes to diplomacy or when it comes to negotiations or business or even
Right.
education, like, will me sharing this information or this thought or this idea improve this situation? Will it
Mhm.
make it worse? Is there fruit that can come from this? Or is this a situation or person I need to avoid? Right? Because to me, the only time I have ever physically gotten a fight is protecting someone else, protecting
Okay.
myself or protecting someone else. And
Yeah.
so our energy is constantly being pulled 24/7 from our phones, from the media, like all this negativity, right? And so it's so hard to not get caught up in it. Like, what else happened today? Like, let's go down the rabbit hole. But to be able to protect your energy and to be able to walk into rooms where there may be people that either you disagree with or
Mhm.
who actually really are bad people who have bad intentions, and just
Right.
having that maturity to recognize the difference. Anyway, but that's just
No, you reached a good point though, because I think it's important to recognize the different gifts that people have and how
Mhm,
they will be utilizing it at a time like this. And
mhm,
some people do take up the mantle in other ways, right? And
mhm.
I think that the most important thing is like being authentic for me and my peace of mind.
Yes. So what is that? Okay, so you were in education, you got your
Right.
doctorate in education. You where did you go from there? Like tell us how you started your career post
Okay.
education and then
Post-graduate.
also when you started your business.
Okay, so
Because it
post
all leads to the next thing.
At least to the next. So post education is the year 2017. So that's when I earned my doctorate from San Jose State University. And I spent another year after that working for the same institution to wrap up the DEI work. And then I shifted in 2018, mid-year, to launch a business. Because at that point, people heard about the work that I did at the institution. Folks would reach out to me for advice or to talk about what's happening within their board, with the children. But
Mm,
that's not necessarily the same as being an entrepreneur. But luckily, I had friends who were entrepreneurs. So this is before I found out, and I don't like services like a legal Zoom and so forth. So I actually
mhm.
went to the county clerk office in San Mateo and did it that way, filed a
The
petition
old school.
name. I put an ad out in the newspaper that had to
Yep.
run for
Yep.
30 days. I did it
Yep.
that way because that's
Yep.
the only way I knew how to do it. And
Yep.
so I did it as a sole proprietor first. So it was a full year of that. And I had clients. I was pretty fortunate. So by 2019, I shifted to LLC and started to learn more about entrepreneurship and resources that were available, like the idea that I could work with the government at some point with these certifications and so forth.
Mhm.
But initially, it was filling out the paperwork, handing it in, and doing it that way to get started.
So something you said earlier, and it was your apprehension about grad school. And I understand that, some of us struggle, those of us that are not narcissists,
Hmm.
struggle with something called imposter syndrome,
Hmm.
right? I don't know if you've ever dealt with that in your career of like, um, you're in these rooms and you feel like, do I belong here? Do I have something to contribute? Right. And people are going to find out that I'm a fraud or I'm just faking it or, but if you've done the work, you can be confident in the work that you've done. Right. But having
Right.
that mentality of, um, when that coach reached out to you and said, "Hey, you got
Yeah.
something. You belong in these rooms. You're just as talented and smart as any of these other people that are already where you want to be." And so, on a business front, I want to encourage you and I want to encourage other people because I'm going through this myself.
Yeah.
You took your educational experience and the work you were already doing
Yeah.
and packaged it to a business that the marketplace needed. And that's where I have a passion to help people like yourself who
Mhm.
have the talent, who put in the work, who people need to hear your message, but maybe you didn't know how to file a fictitious business name. Maybe you didn't understand tax. You do now, but maybe
Right.
you didn't know how to do government contracting or how to network or whatever. So that's just where my passion is because there's a lot of folks that have the skills, have the experience, but maybe because they don't have the degree or they don't have the title, they don't feel as confident. But a
Right.
lot that one thing that social media has done, for better or for worse, it has leveled the playing field.
Right.
So
There's a lot of information. There's a lot of information, and it takes persistence.
mhm,
That's what I've learned over these past 6.5 years is just persistence, just keeping at it and leveraging resources that are out there. And then, constantly staying abreast of like the industry, what's happening within the industry and how to respond.
yeah. So you got started during the first Trump administration with work around diversity. Then the pandemic happened,
Then
and
it,
you had to pivot there.
right. I did
And
every
then
remote. My business skyrocketed there
awesome.
during that time frame. Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, because at that particular time, we knew there was like all the civil unrest and the killings of unarmed Black males, and the response to people being indoors and learning a little bit more about those social injustices. People
Mm,
felt really energized to protest and speak out against that across
yeah.
racial lines. So I was in a situation where I was able to be a part of panel discussions, to organize trainings, and to be able to provide that safe space to have those conversations. But it was also in terms of like the fiscal budgets that a lot of schools and other organizations had, they were able to onboard my business. And that work has persisted past that 2024. I just wrapped up some work a year ago with someone that I started to work with in that time frame, a client then. So it was one of those moments where it teaches me that the pendulum always swing. So even in this current climate, I know I'm not abandoning my mission or my business, even if I, you know, go about it in a unique way, I'm still
Yeah,
going to operate past this year,
that's great
following year.
because it's needed more than ever, right?
Right.
It's needed more than ever, and I appreciate that you're willing to pivot and make adjustments. And that's what people do. You know, if you look at any wartime
Mhm.
general, they make adjustments. You look at a sailor on the ocean, they have to adjust the sails
Right, right,
to the way that the wind is blowing. It doesn't mean that you change who you are at your core.
right.
It just means that if you're in a different country, you speak a different language. And this country you're in right now might be different than the one you were in
Mhm.
before, right? And so act accordingly. How did you get connected with UC Santa Cruz? Tell us about that.
So how did I get connected with UC? Oh, this is important detail. I joined UC Santa Cruz while starting my business.
Mm,
As I mentioned, when I was in an administrative role as a director of diversity, I met a lot of people. Like there were sometimes work ended and people would line up outside my door to talk to me from a completely different campus or different city. And I was
wow.
always receptive to it because I love the work that I do and I would just be that resource.
You
Like,
need to raise your
what's
prices,
going
girl.
on? Let me help you. So I created that space for someone. And when they
Mm,
found out I was transitioning to launch my business, they reached out to say, I'm an instructor at UC Santa Cruz, and I really believe you should consider coming over and being an adjunct because your skill sets and what you do will be perfect for this social justice department. And
so
that is how
cool.
I learned about UC Santa Cruz. And by the way, it wasn't like I just walked in there and got the position either. I had never worked in higher education before. So I
Mm,
really had to go in there in the interview and think about like the application of even what I've learned working in the K through 12 space, how that's
mm,
transferable to working with first gen college students, students from all backgrounds in higher education. So I
mm.
specifically remember that interview because that was my first time on UC Santa Cruz campus. It was incredibly hot outside. However, when I walked into the interview, I felt like I belonged
Good.
with the provost, with the folks who were interviewing me, it seemed like very sincere.
Mm,
And I remember my sister called me and she was like, how do you feel? I'm like, I could see myself being at this institution. And it's 2000, we're what, 2025, and I'm up for continuing lecture status. So I just wrapped up my excellence review. So I definitely didn't think I would be here for this long or be there for that long, but it really just works perfectly with the type of work I already do.
congratulations.
Yeah.
And uh, and because I struggle with this, how do you balance multiple passions? Obviously, for some folks, it's like if they're going to be a business owner, that's all they can do. If they're going to be a professor, that's all they can do. But you're doing both successfully. And I'm kind of similar in that way that I have multiple interests. So
Right.
how do you balance it?
It actually is really hard. But I'm part-time at UC Santa Cruz for that reason. And I found a schedule 6 years ago and I stuck with it. I teach the same
Mm,
time I've been teaching since then. And I think it's being mindful of what environment you enter. Like I work for
yeah,
institutions where you work for them, like their assumption is that like you're 100% on board with what they have going on.
right.
They're really not trying to encourage you or support you in pursuing other interests that you have. There's a lot of freedom and autonomy on the team that I work with, and even at UC Santa Cruz, to understand that I'm a multifaceted woman. So
Mm.
yes, I do operate a business and I am a lecturer and I do both well. And I also have family and hobbies and things that I love. And no one's ever argued with me because, like,
Not when you put it like that. It would be impossible to argue with that.
and
Yeah.
I think it makes like, I say that to say, because you brought up imposter syndrome. I haven't
Yeah.
experienced that at UC Santa,
Mm,
but I recognize that does happen. I experienced that earlier on in my high school days primarily, but professionally, it's really great actually to be able to speak to who I am with students in the classroom or bring my knowledge amongst the team because I'm not just the instructor. 2 years into my position, I was appointed to be what's called the core course coordinator. So I design all the curriculum. I lead the training for other lecturers. I support them throughout the quarter. So I kind of wear both hats at the university now.
I mean, I know that, you know, I grew up in North Monterey County and Santa Cruz County, and the public schools there, the demographics are, a lot of, um, you know, children of immigrant communities
Right.
and farm labor, and that's kind of the demographics of a lot of the communities that we grew up in. And so the educational systems reflect that. And there's a lot of great field trips and different outreach that a lot of the teachers are coming from Santa Cruz and really
Yeah.
just awesome people, big hearts. But the realities are, it's sometimes challenging to overcome some of those cultural barriers, some of those economic barriers. But I do have a passion, and to be honest, I struggle with it myself sometimes. I
Mhm.
have a passion to provide those opportunities and let those students know that they belong in those same rooms. In fact, that those rooms would be better by their presence and their contributions. And so I have in my own life struggle with that. I'm aware of how I look and how I sound and the privileges that come with that. But that's not necessarily how I grew up. And so it's always been this interesting
Yeah.
internal dynamic and identity crisis for myself. Just having the confidence to know, and there's a certain demographic of folks that would never doubt that or question that. Why would they ever question or doubt that?
Right.
And then others who grew up without it miss out on opportunities, whether it be in business, whether it be in education. I mean, I know that there's people who didn't marry the person they wanted to marry for certain reasons. They didn't go after the job or the military service or the degree that they wanted because they were afraid of what their family might think, or maybe they didn't have the resume or the credentials. And I just hope that this message, that your work and that my work can help break that ceiling and that barrier that says, hey, if you're willing to put in the work, anything is possible.
No, I appreciate you saying that because in my role as an instructor, I have encountered students who have struggled and also doubted whether or not they want to continue after the first year. And so many factors play a role. And it is being a first generation college student where it does just feel completely overwhelming.
Yes.
Navigating school for the first time, being away from home, and especially for students who do not live on campus, so they commute and go back home. So they're trying to figure out the community. And I think it's important to note like the structural landscape of an institution plays an impact. Right.
Mhm.
So UC Santa Cruz is in the forest. So it's not like a traditional school where like there's a
It's beautiful, but it's out there.
it's beautiful, but it's out there. It's not like it's a hub. You go to this part of campus and everyone's come together there. So you
Right.
do have these smaller colleges on that campus. So it could feel overwhelming to figure out what group can I be a part of. And that's
Right.
why connected to conversations around inclusion and diversity, those spaces on campus where it is a Chicano studies or a center
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
like an ABC for African American, Black, Caribbean students, people who are hired in those positions to support students, those are not just outlets, they're actually college advising, helping students think about their
Awesome.
career,
Awesome.
connecting them to the psychology and counseling on campus. So those services and programs could really make the difference of a child, not a child, a young adult staying to finish their education versus walking away because it feels too overwhelming.
I agree. And I think you can be inspired or supported by anyone, right?
Yeah.
Someone who cares. And we've all have stories of teachers and mentors that are the reason why we pursued certain things or made a difference in our life. But there is something to be said for seeing someone like you succeed in a position that you want to be
Right.
in. It just, it, either you get that or you don't. There's
Right.
something to be said for visibility and just that, you know, for someone to say, hey, if this person can do it and they come from a similar background as me,
Yeah.
whether that's cultural or whether that's economic, then maybe I can too.
That's true.
And maybe I can take it further or put my own spin on it. So um, I'm super grateful to have been connected with you. I know we've been working on different projects. I'm
Yeah.
excited to see that your business, I hope that your business thrives this year when
Thank you, Jordan.
it wouldn't make sense, but yet it would. That because
Right.
you've done the hard work to get it to this point, and I know that even with the challenges currently at the federal level, there's still going to be opportunities because the
Mhm.
work that you do is important. Where can people find you to continue following this journey with you and request your services or learn more about you?
Thank you. So I do have a website, DEIcapacitybuilding.com. So the website is up. I'm on social media as well on LinkedIn, Birts Equity and Inclusion Solutions, on Instagram, Facebook, and I am on TikTok now.
It took me a long time to get on as well. and then I got off, I got back on, and then I was all excited about it, and then it got banned, and I
Right.
got back on, and so I'm gonna enjoy it as long as it lasts. It's
Right.
definitely
Yeah.
some people think, oh, it's all the same. Each site is actually very, very different.
It is different. I will say, in terms of like educational content, Instagram is like the hub of where I'm introducing a lot of ideas and initiatives. So that's B as in boy, so BEI Solutions LLC. So you can follow us there and
Awesome.
reach out anytime,
Well,
right?
I think anybody who is going to listen to this conversation or watch this conversation, um, they're going to agree with me that we're excited to see you creating more content. I know you've been doing it for the past decade already, but I'm excited that you're finally going to start capturing some of that content
Yes,
and sharing it with the world. So we're excited to see it, and I'm excited to see, all the projects you're going to work on in the near future. I'm grateful to be connected to you, and thank you so much for your time today.
you're
And we look
welcome.
forward to everything coming the rest of this year. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Jordan, for having me.
Take care.